Thank you for your hard work. Today we're starting the first lesson of the formulation training series that takes place on Thursdays. As we previously announced, the central topic for this session is, in fact, all about exploring the critical question of when it is the appropriate time to make a change to a formula. Let me give you a general overview of this course. Basically, it's a well-known aspect of human nature that people generally don't welcome change. More specifically, when individuals are in a comfortable and stable situation, particularly if they are actively benefiting from that stability and gaining significant profit or security, they don't feel a compelling need to change, and in many cases, they are even deeply afraid of the uncertainty it brings. And I've witnessed this many times. There have been cases where, honestly, you could very easily prove to the factory that if they made even a minor change to their product, either the product quality would improve, or, for example, there would be economic savings and so on. I'll explain more about this in the next slide, specifically what key factors actually indicate that it's time to change your product. But despite this awareness, despite having this information at their disposal, they are extremely afraid of changing their product. So in this course, I plan to teach 2 or 3 main things. For context, the full unabridged version of our main course is designed to span a total of 3 hours. However, for this particular presentation, we have adapted the material into a much more condensed and accessible format that comes in at about an hour and a half. This is our free training, and if you find it useful, you can actually purchase our main course, but I recommend that you definitely subscribe to us so you'll receive the next sessions of this course as well. What I am going to teach you in this course is actually centered around 2 main topics. First, we will explore when it is truly necessary to make a change, what that specific change should look like, and what steps you will need to take to successfully achieve it. And the second topic is all about the actual process of writing formulas and how you can determine for yourself which ingredient is suitable for which topic and for which formula. One of the common questions that always comes up is whether the formula I have right now will always be effective. Definitely not, because it implies a lot of things which I'll explain to you now, and in fact it forces you to make changes to your products. You see, the fundamental formula of a manufacturing plant is truly the very heart and core of that entire factory's operational existence. That is to say, when this vital heart does not function or work properly and efficiently, the entire intricate system inevitably shuts down completely. And there are indeed a few crucial and significant factors that clearly show you precisely when it is actually the opportune and necessary time to consider changing the existing formulation. When you don't have the required quality. Now, this lack of quality isn't just about the product's quality itself. Sometimes you see that, for example, you're supposed to produce the product at a high capacity, but because of a mistake choosing the wrong raw materials, your production capacity has actually decreased. I often give this example in polymer discussions and in our training courses, or in fact the customer's needs have changed. That is, time passes. The customer no longer actually uses those old, outdated products. Their product offerings, specific requests, and evolving needs have significantly changed over time, and you are therefore absolutely forced to meet the customer's current needs in order to be able to successfully sell your goods and services. The next significant issue that arises is that your operational costs have substantially increased. Now, this increase in costs could include, for example, a change in the price of even one of your raw materials. For any reason, for instance, this material has become more expensive. Now let me give you a very simple example. For example, in solar panels, for the backside of the panel to protect it, they use certain films called backsheet. Well, when the price of this product, for example, changes over time, even in a specific country due to certain circumstances, it might go up. Naturally, the manufacturer, in order to protect their own interests and maintain economic viability, might look for an alternative or a general change. For example, I have often seen that many factories, instead of using backsheet, have turned to using glass to protect the backside of the panel. Sometimes these economic changes are due to political programs, a country's policies, or simply because the price of raw materials is no longer profitable for you. Or you can no longer sell your product at the previous price because there's too much competition, or the price of your product has dropped and you're forced to make changes. Otherwise, you won't be able to make a profit. And another issue is that for various reasons, whether health related or, political reasons like sanctions or other factors, You may no longer have access to a certain raw material. For example, the World Health Organization might come and permanently ban a certain raw material, announcing that this substance is, say, harmful to the environment, to humans, or to anything else, and you'll be forced to look for an alternative material. So don't be afraid of change. That is, if any of the situations I mentioned happen, the circumstances will force you, and if you don't do it, the first person to suffer losses will be you yourself. So you're compelled to make this formulation change, and now the question is how to actually go about doing it. I'll explain the main points to you in today's video, but as I mentioned, you can find the detailed explanation in our main course and in our main educational package. I hope that even these main points will be useful for you and help you make the best choices for your own productions. One of the things to consider. Now, before I continue with the discussion, I want to tell you that actually you can have two types of changes. The first type of change is a minor change. That means you change a certain percentage of your materials, or you add an additive to your materials, for example, to improve its quality, or you use a specific additive. Or perhaps, I don't know, in what could be considered an exceptionally minor way, without the requirement of making any modifications whatsoever to your existing machinery. And furthermore, without the necessity of implementing any changes to your main production line either. And regarding the situation, actually in most cases these changes are very minor, but sometimes we are forced to make more fundamental or major changes. Those fundamental changes are like when you lose one of your main raw materials, and the complete removal of that key material is going to disrupt the structure of your factory and sometimes even force you to change your machinery or even alter your investment model. Well, naturally, the risk in the second case is much higher. Now, in this very video, I'm actually going to explain to you in detail what key points you should pay attention to and what specific steps you should take so that you can try to make these important changes to your products with the least amount of potential risk. The first thing I recommend is to make your decision based on scientific data, not emotions, both in terms of positive and negative emotions. That is, if you are planning to make a change, first make sure that, for example, all the necessary tests and assessments have been carried out and the required quality controls have been done, and that you are convinced scientifically and based on data that making this change will be economically beneficial for you, or that making this change will, for example, improve quality for you. Under no circumstances should you make this change just because of pressure from your competitors or your customers. This is a very important point. I've seen many times that a lot of factories, for example, say, well, I saw that my competitor's factory did something like this. Now, if I simply copy them, I'm just going to fall behind them. And reacting out of fear is absolutely the worst possible reason for you to decide to make a fundamental change. You see, I always have a saying that I truly believe in, is that every single factory has its own unique secret formula. This means that even if you attempt to produce two products that appear to be completely similar on the surface, they will always have their own distinct characteristics. It's important to remember that because, just as I mentioned earlier in our discussion on industrial scale production methods, your own individual target point could be substantially different from the target point of another person. The target point is determined by the owner or the investor of that factory. For example, let's say I produce a product and I have a very specific quality standard in mind for it. Additionally, I might have a particular target market in mind, or perhaps a certain income ceiling for my customers. And because of that, it's really not a good idea to make decisions about your formula or to change your formula just for the sake of competing with your rivals or copying what others are doing. This is because doing so carries a significant amount of risk for you and your business. It's like a medicine that works for one patient, and then another patient comes along and says, oh, I have the same illness, so I should take this medicine too. On the other hand, inside an individual's body, it might trigger a reaction that is entirely different. This is precisely the reason I make sure to consult my doctor, and it is vitally important that you avoid making changes to your health regimen based only on feelings. Make decisions about it based on science, logic, and data. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the best thing to do is to prepare a checklist for yourself, and in that checklist basically ask yourself whether the real problem has actually been identified. Have enough data been collected to make a decision about changing the formulation? Have I, for example, conducted a pilot test, and am I sure that this change can actually bring about the breakthrough that I'm waiting for? And has its impact on the production line and on my economic scale been evaluated or not? These are very important, and if you actually prepare this checklist for yourself, at the very least, you can be sure that you're making decisions about the changes you're implementing with your eyes open. The first point I want to tell you about change is that, first of all, you should make changes gradually, not suddenly. That is, except in cases where your circumstances force you to make a sudden change, like I mentioned before, such as economic issues or sanctions. For example, you either have to shut down your factory or make the necessary changes to your product. In exactly such cases, try to implement change with thorough research and gradually. And be sure to document every step of the change process. The reason for this is that when you change several different factors all at the same time, you actually won't be able to immediately recognize or understand the specific results of each individual action. And I always mention this in my production line method videos, that in the quality control unit, even the smallest change, even the tiniest change, now this change could be a change in temperature, it could be a change in pressure, or it could be a change in raw materials. Record even your smallest changes together with the date, with the time, so that if later on, for example, your intended production runs into a problem, not now, but later on after it's been processed, for example, to start things off, I am going to give you some specific examples to look at today. After that, we can then go back and carefully figure out which one of these particular factors is the one that actually caused the change. And I absolutely do not recommend changing several factors at the same time, because in that case, tracking down the actual defect in your product becomes very difficult. That is, if you change the amount of material at the same time. And for example, you also change the temperature. And I don't know, when you change 2 or 3 factors together, actually tracking it becomes very difficult. There's also 1 or 2 other topics that I actually want to tell you about. One of them is that, look, as I said, try to find your own factory formula. I personally have had the experience that all the factories producing, for example, this material were using the same raw material. All those factories would in fact go and buy that raw material as a standard and produce the final product from it. I also intended to produce that final product, but getting access to that raw material was very difficult and of course very costly for me. And through the research I did, I was able to find an alternative raw material that, believe it or not, was actually 10 times cheaper than the main raw material that everyone is currently using in the market, 10 times cheaper. And I made a huge profit from this product. That is, I produced the same product, achieved the same result, but with a different raw material. That is why my strongest recommendation to each and every one of you is to absolutely avoid simply copying what other people are doing. And remember, just because many others are doing something a certain way, it doesn't automatically mean it's the correct or the best thing for you to do. It is far more valuable to develop your own unique factory formula for yourself. This is done through diligent study, conducting your own thorough research, consulting with experienced individuals, and by obtaining and testing all the necessary samples to validate your conclusions. And the next point is the same fear I mentioned, which actually arises from change. When a problem arises in your factory, or when an ingredient becomes prohibited, or when something happens, don't immediately get stressed out. And don't let that stress cause you to make hasty decisions. Look, sometimes some problems are much easier to solve than you think. And don't always look for a complicated solution. Don't always look for, I don't know, a big change. As a general rule of thumb, it is preferable to try and make your necessary changes with the absolute minimum number of possible adjustments. And for example, I have often seen, particularly in situations where someone is about to adopt a brand new technology into their workflow, that their first instinct is to immediately start looking into purchasing entirely new and expensive machinery. They say, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this machinery now. I don't know how much it's going to cost me. After all, I've invested so much already. I can honestly say that in 90% of cases, if you consult with someone who knows the job, understands the formula of your field, and is thoroughly familiar with your formula, you'll see that in many cases, it's actually possible for you to both adopt the new technology and not have to make any changes to your machinery, or with minimal adjustments, like changing the thickness of a suitcase, adjusting the pressure, or changing the temperature. You can actually adapt yourself to that new technology. Don't get swept up by the hype around you. This is a very important point when it comes to changing formulas. And speaking from personal experience, this is a challenge I have actually encountered a great deal myself. Addressing this issue is what will ultimately allow your product to successfully enter and find its place within the highly competitive market. In other words, don't be afraid of that change and transformation, of the revolution you're creating in your product, so that you actually do it in very small amounts, because you've really seen it happen. Sometimes, seemingly all of a sudden, a successful product can be completely wiped out from the market overnight, and as a consequence, the owner of the factory that produces it goes bankrupt. And I've witnessed this kind of thing many times. And finally, before I wrap up my talk, I wanted to share a few examples of things I've personally witnessed. For instance, there have been cases where I saw someone say, well, my competitor is producing a much higher quality shoe and has really taken over the market. I want to do the same. So he consulted with an expert, and the expert told him, for example, to increase the percentage of a certain material. Without actually checking the results and effects of increasing that percentage, he went ahead and did it. At first, he sold well and sales were good. But after a while, because the durability of his product had decreased and the shoes no longer had the same stability, it seriously affected the quality of his product, and he ended up suffering significant losses. Or, for example, especially when it comes to polyurethane materials or machinery. For instance, I once saw a truly remarkable and profoundly impactful film that really had a significant and lasting impact on me, and I'll just share a small yet very meaningful part of that particular film with you right now. The factory owner had replaced the factory manager, and the new manager decided to change the design of the jars they were producing from square to a different shape. They produced the new jars, filled them, sealed them, and sent them to the market. In that film, a child goes and buys the jars, brings them home, and no matter how hard he tries, he can't open the lid. He gives it to an adult because he was in a hurry to go to school, but the adult can't open it either. Still, the child doesn't give up and keeps trying. He gives it to his school teacher, to his neighbor, and finally, after coming back from school, he takes the product to the shopkeeper and asks him to open the jar, but he can't open it either. He brings another jar and then another, and they realize that none of the jars from the new batch can be opened. All the products are returned to the factory, and the neighboring supermarket notices this too. Truckloads of products are sent back to the factory, all because of a 1 millimeter change made to the mouth of the jar. With this small change in the new production model, when the lid was closed, it fit so tightly that it couldn't be opened anymore. What I truly want to emphasize and say is that even a seemingly minor change can bring you to the very brink of complete failure, while a thoroughly well-considered change can genuinely multiply your chances of achieving success several times over. That is, if you currently have a product, for example, if you make changes to a product with proper consultation and accurate identification, or for example, if you add an additive, again, I've witnessed this myself, a polymer factory, for instance, by adding an additive, increased the heat resistance of their polymer and became the only one in the world selling polymer materials at that temperature range. Well, they became unique, managed to take over the market, and went from being just an ordinary factory among many competitors to standing out and becoming very successful. You can decide whether you always want to simply copy what others have already done, or whether you truly want to innovate within your own specific industry and proactively make significant, impactful changes. For example, consider a company like Apple. You can genuinely let people get incredibly excited to eagerly anticipate and see your new, groundbreaking changes. This is an absolutely critical and profoundly important aspect. You see, when you carefully look at many of the most successful and influential companies in the entire world, such as prominent car manufacturing companies, leading mobile phone technology companies, and numerous other innovative enterprises, people are consistently and eagerly waiting to see precisely what revolutionary and transformative changes the new model or iteration will ultimately bring, and what essential updates and enhancements have been meticulously made. These forward-thinking companies are constantly and diligently reviewing new cutting-edge features, exploring advanced new technologies, and adapting to evolving new market conditions. The only significant difference is that they accomplish this in a very mature, well-structured, and highly professional way. They possess dedicated teams that thoroughly research and meticulously develop these crucial changes, and they are always actively working on them with continuous effort. So do not be afraid of embracing necessary change, but at the very same time, do not undertake it without proper comprehensive study and extensive, diligent research. Allow yourself to truly let people with different backgrounds and expertise give you their opinions on this matter. You can't make changes in your company just by consulting one expert. You definitely need to examine things much more thoroughly, check the accuracy, the sustainability, and the possible conditions that might arise for you in the future. In other words, don't just think about your sales and production today. I won't take up much of your time. I just suggest that you definitely subscribe to us so that in the coming Thursdays, we can talk about how to figure out whether this change is actually suitable for your product or not. In this course, we don't just talk about understanding and maintaining suitability. We'll also cover topics about writing a new specification. Although the main content will be presented in my main course, I hope this course will be useful for you and encourage you to get our main course as well. Wishing you success. Have a great day.